Okay, welcome everyone to yet another edition of TradeView Live. I'm your host, Ben Tracy. I lead strategic business development at Vision, joined here by my co-host, Kyle, CEO, co-founder. All right, we don't have a guest today, but we have a lot we want to talk about, a lot that's been happening over the last few weeks. Before we dive into that, we might have some newer folks attending. Let's go through our disclaimers. First of all, TradeView. What is this? What are we here to talk about?
Yeah, the session's called TradeView Live because we use our product TradeView, which is the industry-leading trade intelligence platform, to generate this research insights and answers and hopefully actionable intelligence for the audience. And the TradeView product line covers 57% of all ocean freight, 3 times more than any other platform out there. We've already done the tough work of profiling the companies, so 1.5 million profiles. Because we get unprecedented access to quite a few ocean bookings, it allows us to have 90-day trade forecasts. And with the history that we have, which is more than 10 years, we're sitting on detailed supplier and product networks mapped out. Plus, in the age of AI, there's a built-in researcher in the platform that can help you both get answers out of the TradeView data, but also mesh this data with third-party outside sources to get even more detailed research and answers.
And speaking of the data, what is it? Where does it come from? How do we acquire it?
Yeah, so we've spent the time, money, and effort to build more than 270 proprietary data connections across the industry. So these can be to ocean carriers, to LSPs, to governments, licensing data such as AIS, building our own data sets, et cetera, and directly connecting to ports and terminals. And so this offers unprecedented both access and latency into what is happening in global trade based on ocean freight than anything else out there.
And last question before we dive in, speaking of latency, we'll be talking about a lot of leading indicators, forward-looking indicators. How are we able to look so far ahead into the state of global trade?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we have 56% coverage on all ocean bookings worldwide. About 2/3 of those we see from the time the booking is requested. So that allows us to understand what volumes of freight with what products across what companies are being planned to be moved over the next 90 days and understand when they're expected to arrive. So that allows us to forecast the future with great precision, granularity, and therefore accuracy as well.
Yep. Okay. So let's get into this discussion. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. There's not much going on. And so I think for the purpose of showing an analysis on what could happen if it were to reopen, we have a parallel. We have another strait, another canal and region just nearby that is beginning to reopen. So looking at the Suez Canal, what's the timeline of events here? What's happened? What are carriers doing, and when? Walk us through a little bit over the last few months, Kyle.
Yeah, ever since, well, there's been concerns over the security around the Suez Passage for quite some time. If we go back to last year, the increase in tax by Houthi rebels on commercial trade going through the Red Sea, specifically the southern entrance, in response to the wars engaged with Israel, et cetera, really created a security situation where the Red Sea was not being transited. Well, as time went on, tensions, I'll say, changed. I won't say heated up or cooled down one or the other. I'll just say changed, or we became more adapted to them. Ocean carriers decided to start transiting to Suez again. Now, there's a few additional reasons for that. There is some support from different navies across the world to do that, especially the French Navy. And we're seeing some of the first players return to transiting the Suez in February of this year, first with the Gemini alliance going through. But really, this starts to play out in CMA CGM's favor, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But we got some of the main events here that you might want to go over, Ben.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think just in recent months, we have some of the first Suez transits. And based on the success of that, We have future sailings. The Majestic Maersk is expected to transit in just over a week.
Yeah.
Now August is going to be interesting. We have other ports that are going to come into play here, and right now we see that in the bookings, and so it'll be interesting to follow those. Of course, if the conflict with Iran potentially extends to some of these longer range attacks, drones and missiles, all of this could begin to be reversed in terms of the canal, the Suez Canal and the Red Sea reopening.
Yeah, as we saw that sensitivity in late February when the U.S.-Iran war started. But this Asia to Europe is still moving at Cape speed, because predominantly the major volumes are going around the Cape of Good Hope, around the southern tip of Africa.
And that Cape speed is clearly here significantly higher than about 22 to 30 day typical transit time, where just around 40 days as the median today.
That's right. So adding a week and a half to transit time, sometimes 2 weeks, depending on who you're comparing, et cetera. And if you have transshipments involved, it can start getting into the 50, 60 range.
Now, when we look at transits through the Suez, what's happened so far? Which carriers are kind of leading the charge in coming back over the last few months?
Yeah, so CMA CGM certainly led the charge in terms of partially timing and also commitment. But in terms of the share of Suez transits right now, we're actually seeing the higher volume with Maersk and MSC. But you can see the relative, say, volume or plan ratio between the carriers. So if you look at CMA CGM, the grayish blue bar of the horizontal bar chart for CMA is Cape of Good Hope, and yellow is Suez Canal. So as a ratio of what is going effectively from Asia to Europe, CMA has made a much bigger commitment to transiting this Suez than the other carriers have so far, with the exception of Wanhai, but the volume is much lower, and it's a small carrier in general.
So Wanhai, a bit of an outlier, but we see Evergreen here surpassing Maersk even in terms of the percentage share. But yeah, the volume of the transits really being concentrated between MSC and Maersk, with, it seems like, over the next few weeks and the next month, Maersk is likely going to be increasing that percentage share a little bit more than MSC, at least in the near future.
And I wouldn't be surprised if Hapag gets on board not long after that either.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do we expect in terms of performance as this starts to transition, with the Cape of Good Hope still being a route that isn't going anywhere? It looks like the Cape of Good Hope route has actually started to speed up.
Well, a touch out of necessity, right? So we saw the U.S.-Iran hostilities kick off at the end of February. That then kind of forced the carrier to say, well, we're not going to go through the Suez during this time. So we need to rejigger our schedules, rejigger our vessel assignments, et cetera. And so that has led to faster transit times when going around the Cape at the moment. But all the carriers, as we just mentioned, are looking at going through the Suez again, because it is a more efficient route at the end of the day. But the carriers, through shifting vessels from the Trans-Pacific to Asia-Europe trade lane, as well as better adjusting their port calls, really were able to cut a decent amount of time out of the transit for April, May, June, and so far this month of July.
And I know there was some slow sailing as well. So that could potentially be a factor as well, where just the actual sailing speed has been increased. Okay, let's pivot a little bit. Yeah, global demand. There's been a lot of talk about record U.S. imports. Ocean bookings have been up for really all of this year. If you've been listening to what we've been putting out, record U.S. imports should come as no surprise for shipments that have arrived, because they were booked several months ago. But let's look at global ocean booking activity. It seems we're reaching a significant high, almost an all-time high, at least in comparison to last year and the year before.
Higher volumes. I think part of this is also just a risk mitigation factor. Things are far more uncertain now, and ahead of the major consumer seasons, companies have been wanting to get inventory and are willing to carry the inventory costs more so when transit was, say, far more unpredictable. So I think that was part of it, and that's part of why we've heard the story of the earlier peak season, the higher volume peak season. But there's also still just the basics of global growth, right? The global economy has not been shrinking; it's still been growing. And what China, while they didn't hit their targets, were stating that they got 4 point something percent GDP growth year over year recently. So we should be anticipating more volumes. And this is an interesting question as well. I was having a good conversation with Peter Tershwell just yesterday about what does this mean in terms of capacity and managing capacity and rates, et cetera, as we look forward into the future. And is there actually going to be a capacity crunch because there's so many vessels on order? Or have the carriers gotten a lot better at managing this process? And does the world make it easier for them to manage it now, since surcharges are the expectation nowadays?
Right. But it does look like we're coming down a little bit from the peak we saw just a few weeks ago in week 24. We haven't tapered off sharply, but we're down, about 12% from where we were back at the beginning of July.
Yeah. Pulled forward, more volume. And it'd be interesting to see how this line plays out the second half of this year as well, because I wouldn't be surprised if we see it get near the 2025 line at some points in the next few months.
So let's dive into major regions and see if there's differences here. We have, again, all global bookings like we were just seeing on the previous slide, but then broken down by U.S. import activity, Asia outbound, so just all exports from Asia, Asia to Northern Europe, where there's been a lot of attention about that peak season. Chinese exports, like you were just mentioning before, in terms of their overall GDP growth. China to US, that one really stands out here as the outlier, seeing negative growth year over year for this period of peak season, roughly the mid-May to early July timeframe. In comparison to this same time period from last year, we're down almost 12%, while every other region is growing. My mind immediately goes to tariffs. I know there's more at play here. Companies have been moving away from China for some time now, and so maybe tariffs were just a forcing factor. But the China to U.S. import, trade relationship, it doesn't seem like that's going to be increasing anytime soon.
Oh yeah, I mean, tariffs are, I'd say, not the major factor here, because you still see U.S. imports climbing nearly 7%,
right,
but China-U.S. down 12%. So it's rerouting in some way. Whether rerouting, probably not in terms of the finished product, but in the say the path of production at the end of the day. So we didn't have it on this chart, but I think we just saw a peak in Chinese exports to Vietnam for the first time. A new high watermark set. So just an example of how the China plus one or plus nowadays has been playing out, because it does take time for these capital investments to actualize.
And that China export growth is a topic that could potentially be its own episode of TradeView Live, where we just look at, you mentioned the Vietnam relationship, China's exports to Vietnam, but anywhere else that they're looking to grow their trade relationship with, whether it be Mexico or other regions such as Europe. Obviously, Chinese exports are finding other places to go besides the U.S. That's an issue for them.
And even cutting that based upon, does it appear that it's a finished good being shipped versus a, say, an ingredient good of some sort? Because I can see it being quite a bit different, where you're getting quite a few exported finished goods to Europe, South America, Africa, Oceania, but to Southeast Asia, you're really getting a lot of the ingredient goods.
Yeah, exactly. So let's dive into that trade lane we were looking at just a moment ago, Asia to North Europe. Seeing that peak season, really a peak we've not seen for a year and a half for that trade lane. So obviously a lot of this coming from China, but overall, it looks like demand for imports into Northern Europe is at a point we've not seen, and certainly an early peak season, but a peak season that was at a higher point than in the last year and a half.
Yeah, it was two factors. Peak season was earlier, as well as the shift in trade from the US to Europe out of Asia. So those two compounded are giving you percent growths greater than your typical population growth.
Absolutely. But we are just past that peak season. As you can see, the line kind of returning to a lower point. It'll be interesting, though, to see if we continue to remain above 2025 levels.
Now, China to US.
Opposite story here.
Yeah, we see 2025, China to US, that massive peak where the tariff pause was announced. But as you can see, comparing the two lines to one another, that the typical growth you'd be expecting in this relationship, if all things were as they used to be, would put that yellow line slightly higher than the grayish white line. But they're somewhat tracking over one another. But as an area chart, the yellow volume is actually lower volume than I would say that the white volume on this chart.
Lower overall for the year because we don't have that bump. And then it looks like, where we're headed is we're probably going to be close to right at maybe slightly above by 1 or 2% last year's average weekly bookings. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend goes down even more and we end up going quite a bit below last year's numbers as we enter this sort of off-peak season in the fall. But overall, clearly, this is just a cost equation. Importers bringing goods into the U.S. are seeing that it doesn't make sense to bring in goods from China at the same volume they had before. So speaking of that, let's look at U.S. imports overall. We're past our peak, and year to date, 7% growth. Not quite as much as Northern Europe, but certainly at a point where we are seeing U.S. import totals at volumes that we've not seen before.
And this could point to interesting considerations. Statements around the consumer are strong still in the U.S. This will have interesting political ramifications about the quality of the economy as we come into a midterm election season in the fall. So it'll be interesting to see how these numbers play out and affect the rest of everyday life.
Yeah, inflation still isn't spinning out. Interest rates are relatively low, although some would like them to be lower. And I
some
think
would like them to be higher.
Yeah, some would like them to be higher, but I think both of those are in check to the point where U.S. imports are still very strong. So
China exports.
China exports, similar to what we mentioned before. Obviously, China's finding other places to export their goods to besides the United States. 13% above last year. That's quite a strong number. Although you mentioned they didn't quite hit their overall GDP growth target, but in terms of container shipping, continuing to rebound. So let's pivot a little bit to the final topic we want to end on here. Different canal, right? We're going to be talking about the Panama Canal.
That's right.
And why looking at this Gulf Coast versus East Coast, West Coast? What are the implications there? How does that relate to this draft limit, this draft cap that the Panama Canal may be imposing?
Yeah, so the vessel can only sit so low in the water as it's going through the locks. And that doesn't necessarily mean the number of TEUs or boxes on board, but it does have an effect over what products are in those boxes. Because only a certain amount of weight at the end of the day is what's going to decide if that vessel is above or below the draft limit for passing through the canal. And so we see that there's a clear bias here for heavier cargo is typically heading into the Gulf Coast versus the East Coast or the West Coast.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, and we'll see obviously as potential draft caps change, right? Depending on how the El Nino season progresses.
And we could expect maybe that the West Coast with rail connections soak up some of that heavier weight cargo. But we shall see how it plays out.
So what kind of timeline are we looking at here? What's happened so far this month, and what are we going to be looking out for over the next few weeks?
Yeah, we're anticipating that the second cut to the draft limit will happen from 49.5 to 49 feet, and then another cut on August 15th to 48.5 feet. So that's going to squeeze out some of the heaviest cargo from going that route. So you could expect some of the ocean carriers to maybe be saying, hey, I can't actually support that routing that you're trying to book at the moment, because this will be interesting for like the scrap metal shippers who are trying to ship out scrap metal from the Gulf Coast to Asia even, and seeing how that's going to play out. But dense cargo will have challenges going through the Panama Canal.
And lucky for us, in our bookings, in our active shipments that are on the water that we follow, we do actually have the cargo weight indicated by the shipper for each container. So it'll be really interesting to follow that, even if the weight per TEU, the weight per shipment, starts to trend differently with these draft caps.
Yeah. So the choke points in the world are always a topic, and that topic just seems to be popping up towards the top of the list more and more often as the world becomes more uncertain and we return to the wrestling of great powers. So keep attuned to TradeView Live. We're here every 2 weeks. I believe we have a special guest scheduled for 2 weeks from now as well, diving into a bit more around port performance, perhaps. And that we can even bring up some of these weight questions as that comes up as well. But anything you'd add, Ben, as we close out?
I think following the storylines, obviously keeping up with what's going on with the Strait of Hormuz is like, what's the latest tweet did you read? But it looks like, from a stability perspective, the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, beginning to reopen. There's going to be some progress hopefully made in the next 30 days. And with the Panama Canal, we really have to watch for those draft caps being implemented and how that might affect the distribution between East Coast, Gulf Coast, and West Coast. So a lot to follow here in the next 4 weeks.
Well, thank you all for attending and watching. Please leave a comment, share the recording of this, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.